Hi, I'm Bill Young, and I'm joined by a very special guest, Mathew Prichard, who is Agatha Christie's grandson. And Mathew, tell me a little bit about your grandmother, and had she been alive over the course of the 25 years that David Suchet was recording Poirot, what do you think her thoughts would have been?
Well, when she was alive, she was always very nervous about the idea of her characters, particularly Poirot, being represented visually, because she had this big idea that she thought she was an author. Well, she was an author, and she felt that it was nice for the readers to be able to imagine for themselves what Poirot looked like and all that kind of thing. I think the whole idea of visual representation as mainly portrayed on television was foreign to her, so to speak. But of course, she never met David Suchet, still less did she see him play Poirot. And I think that once she had got used to the idea, she would have loved him, respected his professionalism, and valued the contribution that he's made to the wonderful character that she created. I think it's hard to imagine for us, particularly now in 2014, how our lives have been taken over by television. My grandmother never possessed a television, so she thought completely differently. And she thought in terms of books and words, and visual representation came some way down the line. Now, if anything, the whole process is reversed.
As intricate as she made her characters and as intricate as her stories were, when you look at how David portrayed the character of Poirot and just the initial research that he did into her books of determining all of the idiosyncrasies of the character, I can only imagine that she would have approved of him as portraying Poirot. But I think it's almost a match of this. It was the embodiment of her writing on screen.
I think it was, and it's easy for an audience to understand that in the making of any television show, there is a huge amount of rehearsal and all the things that go towards the direct performance that David produces. But I think what isn't very easy for an audience to understand is the whole background behind the whole recreation of a character, the reading of the books, the hours which he spent practicing at home, that little sort of mincing walk, the way he carries his head slightly on one side, all these sort of little things which go towards the making of a character. And that was why I think David was so wonderful. I have never seen anybody on the stage or on television take such infinite pains to make sure that what he produced was what my grandmother wrote. And that, I think, was the thing that he was most proud of.
When she began the overall character of Poirot, the story, as we've come to know, of her seeing the Belgian refugee, this funny little man, and she developed the character of Poirot in her head based on that. Do you think that there was a sense, as she began the stories, that this was going to turn into what it ultimately turned into?
No sense at all. I think, when she wrote her first book, and Poirot was in her first book, Mysterious Affair at Styles, in 1920, I think she was so relieved to have written one book and to have persuaded a publisher to publish it. I mean, she thought that was a triumph. So imagine if you told her that she was going to write 40-odd more books, and that all of them, including not only the 40 novels, but the short stories, all of them would have been portrayed by one man over 25 years. I mean, when you actually state it as baldly as that, it is fantastic. I remember talking to a very respected British film producer called John Braben, who produced the first film of Orient Express. And I remember him telling me, in a, I thought, slightly patronizing way, that if I expected more than 3 or 4 Poirots to be filmed, really, Matthew, you can't expect things like that. I wish I could sort of put him in your chair now and show him a few films that have happened since then. I mean, the story is so unbelievable that, that I don't think my grandmother would have been anywhere near comprehending it.
As private as she was, do you think that in your your relationship with her, do you think that there was ever a sense that she knew of just the joy that she brought to millions and millions of people who read her stories?
I think she did realize that, yes. She always said, particularly, remember the time I knew her, she was, she was born in 1890, so,
right.
It was round about, I suppose, 1950 onwards that I really knew her well. And by then, she was sort of 60 plus. And even then, writing books, the physical part of writing books was quite an effort for her. And she went on doing it almost until she died, because she felt that she had a duty to provide for her faithful readers. With her, remember, it was always readers, not a television audience, nothing else, just readers. And they expected what we used to call in those days a Christi for Christmas. And she was determined that they would have one. So she went on writing these books, and there are some amazing books written from the time that she was 60 until, the time she died when she was just over 80. Some of those late books are marvelous pieces of construction. The later books were never edited because she never allowed them to be edited. But they always had the same effect on the readers. I mean, whether you were in hospital and you needed cheering up, whether you were on a long journey and needed to pass the time, or whatever it was. I mean, Agatha Christie was the book which relaxed you most.
What do you think it is about the character of Poirot himself that he had so many idiosyncrasies? He was always right in his mind. What made him so endearing, do you think?
I think one of the things that, not the only thing, but one of the things that made him so endearing was that, if we're honest with each other, he's sometimes quite irritating. And I think this comes through, and as you probably know, I mean, my grandmother wrote the book in which he finally dies in the 1940s. So, 30 or 40 years before it was eventually published. And I can't do the counting now, but nearly 50 years from now. So I think it is a mixture of professionalism, things that, nobody else has a moustache, nobody else has an egg-shaped head, individualism, and the sort of irritating way in which he sort of has to have, boiled eggs the same size. Everything on a mantelpiece has to be properly organized so that everything is the same distance from the center, order and method and all this kind of thing. And the contempt that he has sometimes for Captain Hastings' intellect, which is so much inferior to his own. It is a whole mixture of things, individualism mixed in with a strong lacing of irritability.
One of the things that I love in the books and also in all of the television adaptations is the summing up of the entire case at the end. Seemed very theater-esque, I guess, in a sense. So Poirot seemed, in a sense, very at home in the theater and kind of bringing that experience to the way he summed up a case.
I think it is undoubtedly true that the summings up, which are, as you say, a great feature of the way my grandmother wrote the books, we've always had a lot of problem with how to actually make them convincing visually, because some of them are quite long. And I know David sort of thinks for weeks when he's making a film, as to the sort of final day when he's going to do the summing up. And it was always the most exhausting and the most demanding day, because that is when he's really on the stage and he does all the talking, all the acting. And there was a famous film, which is the first one we did under the new management at the beginning of the 2000s, called Five Little Pigs, where there is a marvelous summing up. but it is hugely demanding. There's just Poirot in a room with all the suspects, including, of course, the murderer. And it is a very dramatic piece of television, a brilliant piece of script writing. But they aren't always successful on film, because some of them do go on too long, and you know, they're sort of, whatever it is, 20-30% of the whole film, which can't be right.
One of the things, and the overall character of Poirot, which is very important, is his faith. And he was Catholic, but it plays a very important part in his overall way of solving cases. It's almost like he's trying to save souls, too.
He had, like my grandmother, a very strong sense of justice. And I think part of the motivation behind, you know, I'm talking about Poirot himself now, part of the motivation of him solving all these crimes is to make sure that those involved in the dreadful crime of murder are actually brought to book. And I think there is only one famous case. I don't know whether I'm allowed to reveal plots on this program. There's only one famous case which really upset Poirot when he connives at the people who committed a crime actually getting away with it. The version of that story...
This is where I'm supposed to go, la, 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 la.
The version of that story that, one version, I can't remember whether it actually made its way onto the screen in the end, but one version of that has Poirot almost restraining a tear as he really tries to salve his conscience that he is actually allowing some people who actually did connive at doing a murder, even though it was entirely justified, the murdered man was horrible, but even so, Poirot's very strong sense of justice does not prevail.
And we won't mention
that
particular
but
one.
I'm sure everybody knows which one I'm talking about.
So, from your grandmother's standpoint, and again, they are so intricate from a detail standpoint in all of the stories, but they all started very simply from the way she wrote them. And I remember seeing something one time where she would jot down just the how, the when, which is fascinating to think that's the beginning of her excellent writing.
Yes. Well, the page to which you refer, I own the original page, which is part of the Agatha Christie archive, and I can't do the words, but it's just one sort of page of an exercise book, and it says sort of how, when, where, who, etc. And
why.
And why.
Yeah, right.
And that is the whole page. And you can't have a more simple way of describing a detective story than that. And that's really what she felt like. It has always been interesting to me that, in my view, the most successful scripts that have been written based on her books have been the simplest ones. I'll give you two very good examples. The first was the first Orient Express film, which was written by a chap called Paul Dane, and the script contained, much to sort of Hollywood's amazement, contained huge chunks that were almost lifted directly from the book. But it was a hugely successful film. And the last film of Poirot, Curtain, when he dies at the end, was written by a friend of mine called Kevin Elliott. The same applies. It is so simple, the way he has adapted the book. It hardly changes an iota of the original story. And when I think of that, when compared, and I won't mention any names here, some that I think are less successful and invent characters and scenes and situations which my grandmother would not have understood, leave alone written about herself. One wonders really, I think it is a tribute to her genius that the more simple, the more like the original the scripts are, the more successful they are. But then I can hear you saying, I would say that, wouldn't I?
When you talk about Orient Express, I can imagine the very beginning of just the pressure to bring Poirot to the screen for David, but in particular, because the movie was so successful and Albert Finney was wonderful in the movie. The pressure on David to bring that particular episode to screen.
Yeah, well, we waited a long time before we did, and I think that when we did it, the best thing about it was that the whole atmosphere of the Suchet Orient Express was completely different from the original film, which depended, amongst other things, for its success, on a huge galaxy of stars.
It was much more serious too.
Yeah, and quite serious, yes. And David's version was sort of almost more Egyptian. I don't mean Egyptian, almost more Eastern. You know, the train sort of rocked. It was more sort of realistic, but as you say, the end is very serious. And you know, but I think David regarded that as one of his greatest challenges. I think because it was one of the very few books that had got actually a precedent visually, which I think he felt he would like to challenge.
Well, I think it was one of his greatest challenges, but also one of Poirot's greatest challenges also.
What, the story you mean? Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
When you look at the Poirot character, as your grandmother wrote, you know, over the entire arc of all of the stories and short stories, a little bit of a darkness started to set in. It seemed, you know, a brooding character of Poirot, and especially when you look at the final episode. Was that by design, do you think, on her standpoint?
I think you should remember, my grandmother believed in evil. I mean, she believed in the existence of evil. And actually, if you want to interpret it that way, you can find a little darkness in almost all her books, because she was a little bit like her other great character, Miss Marple, in that she was always prepared to see the evil in situations, although actually she was much nicer than Miss Marple and she preferred to see the good in people. But nevertheless, she did believe in evil and its contrast with good, and that came out in almost all her books. And I suppose you are right that the older she got, the more prevalent that became. And I remember a book which actually didn't have Poirot in it, called Endless Night, which was written in the late 1960s, is perhaps the best example of her. The main point for her of writing that book was how evil triumphed over good and damaged seriously young people's lives.
When you think of your grandmother's experiences as a nurse and in the medical arena, and how much that played into her knowledge of poisons and such, are there other things in her real life that you could see come out in the stories that she wrote?
Well, there's the obvious one of archaeology. Her second husband, who I always call my grandfather, but of course he was really my step-grandfather, Max. I mean, he was an archaeologist. And archaeology, I think, and Max were the stimulus in the 1930s to my grandmother getting over a very unhappy period of her life and actually realizing that writing books like she had the talent to do would be really part of her life. And I think that the archaeology and living so much of her life in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria of all places, did actually rejuvenate her after she got married for the second time, and enabled her not only to write the books about archaeology, but many other books as well. It was a complete stimulus for her. And whilst on the subject of Iraq and Syria, I would like to say how desolated both my grandparents would have been at the current situation in Iraq and Syria. They, if you read her autobiography, you will realize how many close friends she had who were Iraqis and Syrians, mostly in the archaeological field, but the diplomatic field as well. And she was so happy there. She lived in a lovely house in Baghdad when they were there, which she called Bayt Agatha, which means may Agatha be blessed, which was what the Iraqis called it. And for all this that's been going on in, you know, the last sort of 10 years or whatever it is, would have really upset my grandparents.
What's your fondest memory of your relationship with your grandmother?
Well, more than I could possibly sum up in you know, between us, but she was almost solely responsible for my love of music. She was, before she began writing, she was a singer herself, and she would actually have preferred to be a singer than a writer when she was young, but she was so shy that she couldn't actually sing a note if there was anybody else in the room, which rather prohibited a career as a professional singer. But she was very musical, and I had the good fortune to be taken when I was young, in my teens and 20s and early 30s. She took me to all the opera festivals all over the world. I was taken to concerts in London. She tried to bring me up to like Shakespeare, but in that she couldn't manage. I've never been a Shakespeare fan. But the music was entirely, and she didn't do it ostentatiously. She didn't tell me, you've got to like this. She took me to things that she thought I would like, and made sure that I took the time to prepare myself for these great musical events. And it's been something that I have enjoyed ever since. And every time I go to an opera now, and I do go quite often, I say a silent prayer of thanks to the person who taught me.
One of the things that many know, but some may not know, is that aside from Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, your grandmother also wrote The Mousetrap.
She did, and she gave it to me when I was 9 years old. I don't remember much about it. I think she
kind of
also
makes it
gave me
hard
a
for
train.
your 10th birthday present to top that, doesn't it?
But The Mousetrap is an amazing phenomenon on its own. It is still going strong in the West End to this day. I forget whether it's now 62 or 63 years old, but it's something like that. It is now an institution in London, like the Tower of London and Buckingham Palace. And believe it or not, it is still a very good play. And a lot of people, as you can imagine, come up to me and say, oh, we went to see The Mousetrap the other day. Sometimes people come to work for the business from obviously working for other people, and I always ask them when they arrive, have you seen The Mousetrap? And it's amazing how many of them say no. So I send them off to see The Mousetrap, and I think, you know, they go rather dutifully, and they take their family and all that kind of thing. They come back the next day and they say, Matthew, you know, we quite enjoyed that.
Well, it's amazing when you think of something that of that nature that's been around for 60 plus years, and you think of her writing for the Miss Marples and the Poirot, and they're just as good today as they were 60, 70, 80 years ago at the time that they were written, and they hold up, and they're going to be timeless from 60, 70, 80 years from now. And there's not a lot you can say today that you're going to remember 60 years from now, and it's all in the writing.
I mean, during the 60 years of its existence, various eminent theatre critics have had a go at The Mousetrap and say how little it is, you know, that it actually contains, that as a play it doesn't really hold water and all that kind of thing. Only goes to show that if that word of mouth is what really matters in the theatre. It's what people who actually go to the theatre, what they say to their friends afterwards, what they say to their children about the experience, all this kind of thing. That's what really matters in the theatre. And The Mousetrap has won every single argument about families going to see it and all enjoying it. It's one of the very few plays, even today in London, where you can take your, says he, you know, your 12-year-old grandson or your 80-year-old grandmother. There are not very many, particularly if you don't like musicals.
Well, it must be fun for you as Agatha Christie's grandson to see different generations read your grandmother's writing.
It is. I now have grandchildren, and one of them at least has begun to read Agatha Christie, and she came rather reluctantly. She's actually very literate and very good at English, and you know, and quite a good writer herself, and all this kind of thing. And she saw all this going on around her, and her father, my son, you know, works with me, so Agatha Christie is in the household. And she said almost condescendingly one day, well, I suppose I better read one of these books then. So she read it, and she looked at her father and said, what's next? And even to her, she's quite intellectual, Emma, and even so, she enjoyed it, and she was even prepared to admit it, which for a sort of 12, 13-year-old these days is quite something.
There's obviously a very significant anniversary coming up next year. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, in 2015, it will be 125 years since my grandmother was born. I think you will agree not many people celebrate 125th anniversary. I mean, obviously everybody is dead. But the excitement that even in 2014 that has been generated professionally and about her work and has been astonishing. And there are going to be all sorts of events, which some of them based around the place where she was born, Torquay in Devon. The BBC in London is sort of making it the sort of second half of next year is a big celebration of the First World War, and so the First World War will be the first 6 months and Agatha Christie in the second 6 months. And I think this is going to be another tremendous celebration of the quality and entertainment that she produced. And I am very proud to be a part of it.
Mathew, one of the things that is very prevalent in a number of British dramas, but particularly in the Poirot episodes, is the supporting cast that surrounds the main character, and how they feed off of each other. And there's an obvious chemistry with all of the supporting cast. Can you speak a little bit about the supporting cast that was in all of the Poirot?
Well, what is interesting is that when David began, there was obviously not only him, but there were also the people who played Captain Hastings, Inspector Japp, and Miss Lemon. And me and my mother had constant discussions with the producer because he believed very firmly that it improved the experience for the audience if Poirot had, his sidekicks, if I can call them that, to play off against. And so Hastings, Japp, and Miss Lemon used to appear on the television screens in books which they never appeared in when my grandmother wrote the original stories. And anyway, this was the theory that, and I think it was with great enjoyment. And in the last couple of films, which you people will be seeing in not very long, Hastings and Miss Lemon and Japp do make a final appearance. But for a long period, we got a bit purer, and we did not allow these people to appear in books in which they were not written, if you see what I mean. But instead, if I can go on to the other guest artists, I mean, I think that the Poirot series has an unrivaled reputation for welcoming artists of the highest possible quality to accompany Poirot on these, in these wonderful films. In fact, dare I say, you're almost nobody as a British film actor now if you haven't appeared in a Poirot. And some very sort of distinguished people. I mean, the most recent example, of course, is Zoe Wanamaker, who appears as Ariadne Oliver. I wish I could remember, the names of all the others. I mean, but
I remember seeing Martin Shaw.
Martin Shaw was a very good example. I think he appeared in, I'll remember in a minute, After the Funeral. Maybe, no, I'm not sure. But anyway.
I remember him.
Yeah, I remember
which one.
Yes. And nobody could believe that we persuaded Martin Shaw to appear. I think he was the murderer, wasn't he?
Yeah. I don't want to give it away. But I mean, I can imagine the phone call that would come to an actor saying, okay, you have Agatha Christie, you have David Suchet, and it's Poirot.
Yes.
How can you say no?
One of the most impressive things is that all these people agreed to appear, and there wasn't a huge sort of fanfare, blaze of trumpets or anything like that all these wonderful actors, but they all, once again, I think they respected David's huge reputation and his professionalism, and they wanted, they enjoyed working with him and actually being a part of creating something that was perhaps increasingly seen to be a piece of history.
Yeah. I know it was tough for David for Curtain, in filming Curtain. Was it tough for you to see it all come to an end?
I couldn't even turn up for the day in which he dies. I mean, I couldn't do it. And I know, because I've talked not only to David, but to his wife, Sheila. I mean, you know, David will almost tell you, or maybe he has told you already, I don't know, but, you know, this was one of the worst days of his life. And he got home and said, what have I done, you know? But I think when the emotion died down, I mean, Curtain is a huge artistic achievement. It is, in my mind, I know it is the last and in some ways, you know, quietly the most famous. It will be this year anyway. But it is a marvelous piece of professional work, Curtain. I think it's, you know, one of the very top Poirots. You haven't asked me which was my favourite one yet, but
I figured that was the question that everybody has asked you. What was your favourite?
Well, I think Five Little Pigs comes very close to it. And one of the very early ones with the first producer, Brian Eastman, the ABC Murders, which is one of my favourite books as well. But that was a wonderful book and a wonderful film.
With Curtain, what was the sequence of events? You mentioned earlier about your grandmother writing it and kind of putting it in a drawer. And it wasn't released, but some 35 years after it was written. What was the sequence of events of she wrote that, but yet it was not released and the books continued?
I think she wrote it, and I think she let her agent read it, and he was appalled, and he said, "What have you done, Agatha? You can't do this." And she said, "Well, I've done it." And he said, "No, you be, so to speak, you be a good girl, and you give me that script, and you let me put it in a very, very safe place, and I will come to any arrangement you like about when it is finally published, but it will not be while you're alive." And that's a rather sort of florid way of saying that she was persuaded in the end that it wasn't a good idea. But the amazing thing, I think she wrote it very quickly, I forget, sort of matter of weeks or whatever. It is a marvelous piece of writing, and one of her most ingenious and brilliant stories. But it stayed in a safe for 35 years.
I think one of the most amazing things is, and it's an amazing tribute to her and her writing ability, is that in her mind that was the closure of the character, yet it was put away, and she continued to write beautiful stories with this character afterwards.
I've now remembered which Martin Shaw appeared in. It was called Three-Act Tragedy.
But was he the murderer?
What?
But was he the murderer?
Yes, he was.